Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Frontline update for the 13th of November 2023. Check out the key to my map on the screen at the moment. You can pause the video and work out what the lines mean when we go through them. Right, we'll go to the northeast sector. We normally deal with the access from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea here, but actually we're going to go north of that almost to the border. We haven't really dealt much with the Dvorichna to the border area. As you can see, there are some red pins from Andriy Perpetua's map to say that this is now contested area. No gains, but there's a little bit of stuff going on there. Well, actually, there are claims that this village here, Topoli, which is in the Russian controlled area, has had a flag, a Ukrainian flag put on top of it. So Ukrainian border guards hoisted the national flag in the village of Topoli in Kharkiv Oblast, which is currently in the so-called grey zone, an area not under anyone's control. Well, it's not actually seen as a grey area by most of the mappers. That is seen as firmly in Russian control. We have the Russian front line for both mappers basically going along the Oskil River here. So that, I think, is really significant because it means the Ukrainians are active across the river and in this general area, but also it appears that there could be activity near the border as well. So that's something to watch out for. The Ukrainians have said that this has previously had swapped hands to Poli. It's not, it is essentially in the grey zone, it appears, generally speaking. But that is good news, I guess, for the Ukrainians, even though there are a couple of red pins up there. Right, we're going to go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, to get a handle on what is going on in the different areas of the front line. And sorry, I'm in the wrong place here, but we go to this northeastern sector where Fitio's spokesperson has stated that the Russian forces continued offensive operations in the Kupiansk direction, but are regrouping because they have not achieved strategic successes in the past month of fighting. Actually, it has gone relatively quiet. We did see the Russians advance, particularly to the south of Travnevi and around Yehidne, Ivanivska, Ordianska, Ivanivka, that area they did make some advances. We saw some advances in the Novoherivka area towards this town of Borova on the Oskil River, a long way from there, but that was the supposed eventual intention. They were caught very short of that objective and were pushed back even in this localized area, so that some of these places like Nadir has switched hands, Novoherivka as well. But they are apparently, according to the Ukrainians, regrouping in this general area because they've failed to achieve their successes. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces seized the initiative in the Kupiansk area and surprised Ukrainian forces, but have since failed to develop their battlefield successes. So I think that is a generalized comment about originally up here when the Ukrainians were fighting and pushing in the Zaporizhia and southern Donetsk regions. The Russians decided to try and catch them on unguarded here, and they were fairly successful in doing so, but as it says, have since failed to capitalize on those initial successes. So Ukrainian forces continued offensive operations in the Kupiansk-Svatova Crimea line on the 12th, that's yesterday, and marginally advanced. Okay, so what's the advance here? Well, we have, don't know what I'm pressing. We have some video footage to show in the Kharkiv region east of Kupiansk near Travnevi. The 30th Mechanized Brigade is taking care of the defense. Here they inspect and clear a Russian landing site with destroyed Russian armored vehicles, and this has been geolocated to the following position. So we'll plug that into the map and see where the Ukrainians are. It appears that they would control this kind of area. They are on the ground clearing stuff out, and that is behind where Syriac Maps has the Russian defensive lines, although in the grey zone probably of Andriy Perpetua's mapping. So that would suggest that probably Syriac Maps is being a little bit charitable with the Russian front line there. These kind of claims go either way. I mean, we've seen that on one day Andriy Perpetua is more accurate, on another day Syriac Maps has got it just right. And that's neither of the mappers' faults. It's just really dynamic, and mappers wait for different evidences to come out and support claims of moving. Here it appears that the Ukrainians probably are a little bit further forward than Syriac Map has it. so there we have it. We're going to move down now to the Bakhmut area. There is obviously still activity taking place along this line, repelled attacks from either side, but nothing too much to report until we get to Bakhmut, where there's a little bit of a rejig near Rozdalivka and Fedorivka area, where the Ukrainians, I don't know that they've made minor gains. It could just be a mapping rejig with a bit more evidence coming out. That's for Deep State Maps, a pro-Ukrainian mapper. But generally speaking, in the Bakhmut area, we have seen some successes for the Russians as they have changed to what has been called an active defense. I don't know. I'd actually go as far as to say they could well be just on a flat-out offensive around Bakhmut. Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled more than 10 Russian assaults in the Dubovo, Vasilivka, Klishchivka and Andriivka areas, as well as Kromovy as well. So that is to say, around Kromovy, around Bakivka, this sort of area. I think towards Bodanivka, there is activity there where the Russians are pushing, and as well around Klishchivka and Andriivka, possibly taking back some lost territory. The Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces have pushed Ukrainian forces out of positions near Bodanivka, which is to the north of Bakhmut, as we were just seeing, and Klishchivka, and that Russian forces have entrenched themselves in Klishchivka. Now, we've heard some of these claims over the last couple of days. I haven't seen any visual evidence of this yet, so take it with a pinch of salt. But there are claims that the Russians are back within the settlement of Klishchivka and are, as they say, trying to entrench themselves there. No evidence to suggest mapping changes as of yet. So those are just, I think, sort of pro-Russian claims at the moment. But we shall see. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces regained control of Bakivka Reservoir north of Bakhmut, although it is unclear if the mill blogger meant that the Russian forces control all the positions around the reservoir. I would have thought they probably did. There was talk the other day from the ISW that there were differences maybe between the south and north sort of shores of this reservoir as was. It's mainly dry now, but I don't know. I would suggest that Russia pretty much controls that whole area. Coming back down to Klishchivka, there were claims, Andrew Perpetual is talking about this, that the Russians are trying to attack through into the village of Klishchivka, which is, as I said yesterday, pretty pointless given the heights behind it and the Ukrainian control of trenches there. That means the only really sensible thing to do is probably move along this area of the high ground along the top towards that trench line, or try and do some kind of larger flanking maneuver. Obviously that would take a lot more effort, but moving through the town is probably not the most sensible move, although that appears to be what the Russians are claiming, that they have a foothold in the town. I just think that leaves them very much open to artillery attacks and doesn't convey too much advantage for the Russians for being there. But then, this comes down to the kind of idea of PR. Is like, we lost Klishchivka, we've got to get it back, even if it means going into a destroyed village and getting hammered by Ukrainian artillery. And then we can come down to, let's look at some of my sources. So here we have, in the Bakhmut direction, says Flash News, the Russians resumed offensive operations. This was announced by Vladimir Fityo, head of the Public Relations Service and Ground Forces Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Quote, activity in this direction has begun with new strength. The enemy there has switched from defensive to active defense. So again, it depends what, this is this idea of like, Flash News interpret that as being offensive operations, or is it active defense? They're just like doing the Russian counterattack as soon as they've lost some ground, just counterattack, and then, or is this a more sustained attacking posture? They are trying to recapture the positions they've lost, and accordingly, in the Bakhmut direction and south of Bakhmut, the enemy is trying to put pressure on our defensive forces, say the Ukrainians. Okay, so moving now to Avdiivka, we're going to come out of Bakhmut and come down to Avdiivka. You can see there are some various claims for different areas, but the north is looking again like the Russians are having more joy than the Ukrainians, although it does come at quite a cost. The Russians have made some gains south of the kind of road areas that they come in and attack. The main one being down sort of here, that goes to the north of the Terracon, but also in this Vesely area as well, where there are these roads there. The Russians have made some gains to the south, as according to Syriac maps, but also in line with actually what Andrew Perpetua has. So it could be catching up with Andrews. And then Syriac maps has some gains across the railway line. Interestingly, not directly at Stepova, and we talked yesterday about how that little bridgehead there that the Russians have supposedly gained, as according to Syriac maps, is probably not a sustained control, and they look like they were pushed back from there. There are various claims to that end, but moving over the railway line between Stepova and the coke plant, I think, is quite a bold move from the Russians, but it's also a worry for the Ukrainians as they are under the Kosh in particularly northern Avdiivka. Okay. ISW says Russian forces continue to attack near Stepova, where we just were, with some mill bloggers claiming that Russian forces reached the outskirts of the settlement, and others claiming that Russian forces hold positions within the settlement. It continues. A Ukrainian Telegram channel specifically covering the tactical situation around Avdiivka claimed on the 11th that Ukrainian forces pushed Russian forces out of Stepova after Russian forces had temporarily established positions in the settlement. And that was when I showed you the Bradley going up and down Stepova road. I think sort of probably this road here. I think just raking the area with its gun, and there was other footage of Russians running into a basement, and that basement being hit by a loitering munition. So I think that's what that represents. It continues. Russian forces are conducting heavy assaults west of Avdiivka waste heap and near the Avdiivka coke plant in northern Avdiivka. A Russian mill blogger claimed on the 12th yesterday that Russian forces made marginal advances near the Tsarska Ochota restaurant immediately south of Avdiivka, although the ISW has not observed that. So this is to say that this area and around the coke plant could well represent this move here. The Russians are pressuring, and some claims that down here, just north of Spartak, near this Tsarska Ochota restaurant, that the Ukrainians are having some, they're being put under some pressure there. Finally, Ukrainian forces conducted recent successful counterattacks near Avdiivka and made marginal gains. Geolocated footage published on the 11th indicates that Ukrainian forces advanced south of Avdiivka near the E50 highway on November the 10th. So there are a few pushes, a few shoves. You've got the E50 highway. We've got deep state maps showing some successes for the Ukrainians in pushing the Russians back along this highway towards Pisky. We had Andrew Perpetua moving his map a little bit too recently, so this would indicate the success there. So let's look at some of these claims. Now, this isn't from this is actually from the 11th, late at night on the 11th, so I didn't share this with you yesterday, but that indicates the push that we just seen between the Stepova and the coke plant area. The Syriac map says the Russian army continue advancing west of the railway and took control over some positions in the northern outskirts of Avdiivka coke plant. We do have here, though, some successes, as according to Global War Monitor, for the Ukrainians pushing back the Russians and recapturing the bridge over the main highway here. So that is actually kind of opposite to what the ISW was indicating, because that is in this area there. So this is a claim that this whole area north of the highway, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back to that bridge. So again, in direct contradiction to the claims that the Russians might well have been succeeding there a little bit. So Tatarigami does a little bit of an analysis of Avdiivka as of yesterday. In line with our earlier projection this week, Russian forces have gained partial temporary control over the eastern portions of Stepova. In this report, we analyse forthcoming developments and explain how we accurately foresaw recent advancements. Okay, so despite negative assessments of the Russian tactics and high losses near Avdiivka, the overall approach has seen partial success. They managed to breach defensive positions north of Avdiivka, reaching the railroad. This jeopardizes Avdiivka's resupply routes, creating few options for the Russians. They can either seize Stepova and attempt to take Berdichi or take control of the AKHZ. Either scenario puts pressure on the primary supply lines to Avdiivka. So just to put that on a map, what the Ukrainians are facing are possible attacks across to Stepova and then Berdichi, indeed also possibly up this railroad towards Novobakhmativka. That's not that Novobakhmativka, but the other one, or across and into the coke plant. But both of those moves around this area will jeopardize this supply route that is already, pretty vulnerable. Anyway, Tatarigami continues. Stepova was heavily shelled and many buildings were destroyed, indicating that Russians would likely advance there, which they did later in the week. Defending piles of rubble is difficult, so taking over Stepova may not be an effective foothold for advancing into Berdichi. We have doubts about the likelihood of Russians advancing into Berdichi from Stepova due to logistical challenges. Although there is an alternative route from the north, it comes with the risk of overextending their logistics, which may leave them vulnerable. So this is to say that in this area from Stepova to Berdichi, actually this is all fairly open, and the Ukrainians do have artillery in the area. That would mean that if the Russians are trying to get across here and then get a foothold in Berdichi and supply their troops as they're doing that, it is somewhat more difficult as this is flatter ground. Whereas getting to, say, the Terracon is quite hilly behind here. I don't know if we can see that on the 3D analysis or 3D rendering, but you can see it's all a bit up and down around this area. There are hills that if you're going to supply, you can get some kind of protection, but as soon as you get out over here, if we come out to this sort of these farmlands, you can see it's all very flat. And as we go across Stepova and then towards Berdichi, this is all like flat ground. It's very easy to see. And in fact, it's almost a little bit downhill from these fields here. So and from behind. So actually this sits in almost a very slight valley that the Ukrainians can have an advantage in sighting Russian forces. So it's not going to be easy for the Russians to take Berdichi without taking, big losses. They can't hide behind hills. They can't try and resupply on the sly so easily. Anyway, to continue, logistics is a major concern for both sides. The Russians will face difficulties in managing logistics across the railroad, as shown in the photo. Many roads will be impassable during the mud season, which will limit resupply routes for defenders as well. So both sides are going to be suffering from the weather, which is already hampering activities to some extent. At present, the Russians do not have fire control over the road linking Avdiivka with other forces. Nevertheless, we have received anecdotal reports suggesting their efforts to use first-person view drones in an attempt to disrupt the supply route along the road, which is interesting. So that's to say that that this road here is actually not under fire control. I'd find that quite bizarre if it's not under some kind of fire control, because that is just 10 kilometers from there. To say that the Russians don't have any, I mean, they've got the ability to have it under fire control, because all you need is artillery in that kind of range to be able to hit the road. So I don't know, but that's at least what Tatarigami says, and continues that they're trying to use drones to get some kind of fire control over the road. Anyway, our team expects Russians to use tactical infantry groups of various sizes in an attempt to gain control in the coke plant. Currently, Russian forces are facing challenges in securing the waste heap and the railroad near the coke plant. The situation seems stable for now, despite some advancement. In summary, the narrow Russian supply lines watched by Ukrainians limit their movements. especially beyond the railroad. As the mud season begins, Ukrainian logistical operations will face challenges, offering Russians chances to target vehicles with artillery and first-person view drones. A little bit of analysis there, suggesting that really, I think the idea is it suggests that the coke plant is probably the best option, but they're struggling to really get robust control over the Terrakon area. But it's not far into the coke plant, so I would expect that assault to come at some point fairly soon. But I also don't know the exact situation with regard to the Ukrainians defending this coke plant and whether they have got quite decent fortifications built, and you'd expect so, which is probably why the Russians have been trying to hit them with FAB 500 bombs to dislodge them from those fortifications and basically reduce the whole thing to rubble. So those are your options around Avdiivka. We'll see how it sort of turns out. Just to add, here is the supposed advance, I think, of the Ukrainians. So the coordinates here, a description: the Russian military successfully attacked the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces in this area. So this is where Ukrainians are. Does this show us anything of note? Let's have a look. So we'll plug those in to Google Earth. And yes, so that does support exactly what we were talking about earlier. So if the Ukrainians are there, then that would suggest that the Russians have been pushed back to this bridge, as was previously claimed, indeed, by Global War Monitor. But I haven't seen that reflected in any of the mappers yet, although there is video footage to suggest that is the case. Of course, I haven't looked into whether that video footage is definitely of the last 24 to 48 hours. Nonetheless, it could be that Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back there. That would be good news for the Ukrainians, of course. Right, then we come on down to Mariinka and Novomakhivka, which have both seen some pretty heavy activity over the course of the last, I guess, week or so. So the ISW says the Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled over 22 Russian assaults near Mariinka and Novomakhivka. Ukrainian forces recently made marginal gains as well in Western Donetsk and reportedly conducted limited ground attacks on November the 12th. Geolocated footage published on the 11th shows Ukrainian forces made marginal advances northeast of Mikhailska. Okay, let's go and check this out then. So, military summary here saying that the Russian military is attacking positions of the Ukrainian armed forces near Mikhailska, and we'll plug that in. So, just to remind you, and it's worth noting that there have been some losses of Russian equipment quite a bit around Novomakhivka and indeed around this whole Vuhledar-Mikhailska area. But the Russians had attacked eastwards out of Mikhailska and have been sort of hit several times here and lost quite a few vehicles, but they have supposedly taken some territory in so doing. This is a geolocation, as mentioned, to suggest Ukrainian forces are in this position. I don't think that suggests any kind of improvement, any kind of advance at all. So I would disagree with the idea that Ukrainian forces have made marginal advances there, and I don't think there's any other geolocation to be done. So sometimes we, as you all know by now from seeing me do this enough, sometimes we have this situation where the ISW makes claims about marginal advances that don't really bear out, but using the evidence that they do. But nonetheless, we'll move to the west a little bit, noting that there is quite a bit of activity still going on in the Vuhledar area. We're going to come to the Velika Novosilka salient. Now, this is somewhere where we have not seen any activity really for a couple of months, and just before we go there, finish off the ISW. Russian mill bloggers claim that positional battles occurred near Vuhledar and Russian forces are hesitant of approaching the settlement due to heavy casualties that the Russian forces suffered in failed attempts to capture Vuhledar in the winter-spring offensive of 22 to 23. So that is this idea that they're a bit reticent to do those big old attacks because of, previous learning in that area. But yeah, Velika Novosilka. So LSW says Russian media aggregator claimed that Russian forces advanced near Staromayorska and Novodonetska on November the 11th. So this is to the east of the Velika Novosilka sort of sector. You have Novodonetsk here and Novomayorska, so some activity around here, but also Staromyorska possibly too. The Russian Vostok battalion, which is deployed in this area, claim that there is a high activity along the entire Uruzhany-Staromakilivka line, and that the neighbouring Russian troops went on the offensive, concluding that November the 12th will be an important day. Which is really interesting that along here there is a high amount of activity, considering that actually we've had several months of really, or at least a month of this area being very quiet, relatively speaking. So something's going on there, right? Here we have some geolocated footage suggesting that the Russians with the support of armored vehicles tried to storm Ukrainian positions, and rapidly they deeply regretted it. Almost all of the assault group was destroyed, and this is something we haven't seen in this area, as I mentioned, we haven't seen for some time. So some high losses for the Russians, kind of like we have seen in Vuhledar, in Novomakilivka, in Avdiivka, and all these places where the Russians are seeking to attack. They are coming across quite a similar situation to what the Ukrainians have come across, although it's not necessarily about the trench lines and fortifications that have led to the Ukrainians being so delayed and not having a territorially successful counteroffensive. The Russians, they come across minefields more, blow up some of their vehicles, and then Ukrainian artillery just hammers the heck out of those vehicles, and they just get destroyed. A bit like the Malatok-Machka part, but not other things that we've seen the Ukrainians have issue with. This is the Russians just everywhere appear to be, or in a large number of places, appear to be trying to pick up this offensive activity and try and change the momentum, but their methodology is no different to what we've seen for the last year, and all the previous times has ended up in tears for the Russians. Well, it's the same again. It's just these lines of vehicles that get slowed down by maybe hitting the odd mine or two. Reporting from Ukraine showed this, I think, on last night's video, getting caught by mines. And then once they're caught by the mines, then the artillery hits them. So the artillery waits until mines take their toll on the Russian column, and then bish bash bosh, they hammer the Russian vehicles. So that has happened again around here. It's as if they kind of don't learn. I keep saying the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, and it just seems to be playing itself out for the Russians. Anyway, Russian mill bloggers, so going westwards now towards Verbove and Robotyne. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces marginally advanced near Novoprokopivka and took positions, northwest of Verbove. So there are claims from the Russians that the Ukrainians have had some success here and even at Novoprokopivka, and there are claims that they might even be inside Novoprokopivka, but we'll see in a second that there's actually some contradictory claims confirming this area. Northwest of Verbove could be what we were talking about the other day, with some success with Ukrainians there. A Ukrainian military observer also reported that Ukrainian forces were successful west of Robotyne and knocked elements of the Russian 13th Motorized Rifle Brigade out of positions on tactical heights in the area. So this is west of here on towards Kopani. And again, we'll hear the contradictory claims there, because Russians, so what they do is the ISW splits up the kind of, this is what the Ukrainians claim, or this is what is claimed of the Ukrainians, and then next paragraph, this is what's claimed in the same area of the Russians. So here we have Russian forces continued offensive operations in western Zaporizhia and made marginal confirmed advances. So geolocated footage published on the 12th indicates that Russian forces made a marginal gain north of Kopani. So it's not quite contradictory, but the Ukrainians might have had success west of Kopani and the Russians have some success north of Kopani. And that is according to geolocated footage. Additional geolocated footage published on the 6th, so it's going back some time, indicates that Russian forces recently recaptured positions at previously lost trenches between Robotyne and Novoprokopivka. Now, although this is like 7 days ago, This is important because it's these possibly these trench lines here. I talked about the alien head, but these trenches that the Ukrainians fought so hard to get, it was really difficult for them to get these trenches. And there is some evidence to suggest the Russians might have taken them back, but whether that's still the case, I don't know. Because you look at this as a global war monitor saying that actually the Ukrainians have some success here. Ukraine soldiers were filmed inside Novoprokopivka 2 days ago, and this shows a slight advance from previous positions. Again, other people, showing footage and whatnot. So interesting there. Military Lab here says Ukrainian infantry unit coming under fire in the northeastern outskirts of Novoprokopivka. So this is exactly what Global War Monitor really was referring to. We'll plug that in and see where that has put the Ukrainians. And yeah, significant because that is right on the Russian front line or defensive line, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and advanced of the past the Russian defensive line, as according to Syriac map. So Ukrainians could be having finally some success in getting into. Although we have seen this before, they've been in, repelled, but you would hope that they might have a bit more success this time around. Who knows? Unpleasant situation for Russians, as according to this source. So they are being hit here, but just gives us an understanding where Russians are maybe in this area. And actually that is to the north of Kopani and shows the Russians on that defensive line that all the mappers pretty much have in that area. So that bears the maps out there. And then finally, this is the one that ISW is referring to from the 6th. So south of Robotyne, a film showing that the Russians managed to counterattack at some point into the south part of this large trench complex west of Robotyne and Novoprokopivka Road. An accurate Ukrainian first-person view drone strike on the Russians in the unoccupied dugout at this position. We'll plug that in. Shows that obviously the Russians are in this position, were on the 6th, but again, you can't tell that they are now. But it's just significant that the Ukrainians have fought really hard to get that, and there is some evidence that the Russians, what I call the alien head, are right back there again. Although it looks even more substantial as a trench network, as you can see here, is a lot more joined up than I had previously given it credit for being. So anyway, that is the geolocation for that, and some strikes on that trench line. So who knows what's going on now? I've said recently that it appears to me, just intuitively, like the Ukrainians have been having a little bit more success around Verbovy and north of Verbovy area, as well as around Novoprokopivka. I don't know what all of that data tells us. It's a bit chaotic, but it could be that the Ukrainians are having some success inside Novoprokopivka. But then again, what is going on with that trench line between Robotyne and Novoprokopivka? Anyway, moving to the west and onto the Dnipro River, we come to an area that has had quite a bit of it's been a focal point for quite a few analysts because, it's all happening around there. Well, actually, Andrew Perpetua shows that the Ukrainians aren't in control or haven't pushed the Russians back quite as far as one might have thought. I don't know if that's the case or whether the Russians have counterattacked. Various sources that I shared with you this morning in my news piece this morning talked about, and both the TASS and RIA Novosti news agencies have declared that in the area the Russians are regrouping and retreating to, scare quotes, better positions. It's how they sell a retreat. But then that was pulled by those news agencies, and lots of people are wondering exactly what's going on. There's all this conversation about, is it the timing of that? And they are going to announce that, but just not yet. In other words, the Ukrainians are causing the Russians some consternation around here, and they are putting back somewhat. There's talk about how this road has been interdicted in 2 places, but then if you have the mappers then pushing the Russian lines slightly further forward, then what does that say? So it's a lot of operational security. Some people claiming Ukrainians are doing better around here than the maps suggest. Again, it's easy to say, but often need a bit more information and evidence. Here is a video that is doing the rounds of the Ukrainians fighting in the forest area, trying to move towards the main supply route, this yellow road there. But though that video footage has been geolocated right to the edge of this forest area, rather than, as some people thinking previously, Ukraine is being active right in the middle of this forest area. But again, can't be sure of the exact timing of that video. Nonetheless, that is where it has been geolocated, as you can see from this map there, very close to the settlement of Krinky itself. No reports said, and this is, bear in mind, this is about 15 hours ago, says the area under Ukrainian control east of central Krinky is slightly reduced, while adding new areas under control in the forest area towards the M14. Very slight advances west towards Kazachi-Lahiri. Russians keep complaining about the lack of aviation support. So slightly less control over here, slightly more control going down that way and towards Kazachi-Lahiri. Who knows, because that's going against what other mappers, say for example Andrew Perpetch is saying there. Anyway, today you're starting to see an awful lot more footage coming out of crossing of the river. So here we have a boat crossing in the fog, using the fog as a protective as a bit of protection, so they can't be seen as easily. And then I think this is that same boat, the same crew, because or at least the guy's already on the shore or from that original boat, and here's another boat coming across, because I'm fairly sure that was a guy who was standing at the front of the boat and that was a guy sitting in it. So this to me indicates that multiple boats are crossing with troops. There are claims that maybe up to 500 troops are now on the left bank of the Dnipro River. We hear from BBC Russia with reference to Russian soldiers themselves that Ukrainians have possibly been dressing up as Russian soldiers, as emergency services personnel, and causing some havoc on the left bank of the Dnipro River, that the Russians are having a hard time. This is a good source to look into. I'm not going to go into it now because it is a massive article, but they are complaining that they don't have, we're seeing quite a lot of Russian complaints that they don't have counter battery fire, they don't have reserves in the area, they're making, and they don't have control of the airspace with regard to drones and electronic warfare. So as I've said before a number of times, this is looking like a fairly positive place for the Ukrainians to be operating. The ISW says of this area, geolocated footage published on the 12th shows that Ukrainian forces made marginal advances further into Krinky. So that's an interesting claim here, but I don't see this. So the evidence they produce is this, which is the same sort of hitting that trench area with FPV drones, and again, I don't know, that does show further improved lines. And then it goes on to say Russians thought they could walk peacefully to the left bank of Kherson. In fact, which is odd. So that's going back to Robotin. That's not even Krinky, and that is referenced. So that's interesting. I thought I was confusing myself there, but I put these two together because this was what was referenced. So I think that I don't know if that's a mistake from the ISW or whether I put it in the wrong place. But nonetheless, here's what they're talking about with regard to Krinky. Some Russian soldiers thought they could walk peacefully onto the left bank of the Kherson region, but the soldiers of the Griffin 501 do not think so. Using your kamikaze drones, so talking to people who have fundraised, they hit a bunch of Russian infantry, need more drones to destroy them all. Now, again, if this is supposedly talking about geolocated footage suggesting Ukrainian marginal advances, I don't think you can ever say that when you are hitting enemy soldiers with drones. It's not you advancing, that's just you. When you've got drones that can now go up to 22 kilometers, that tells you nothing about advances and control on foot, really. So I don't think that does support advances for the Ukrainians in the Krinky area, as at least according to the ISW. I've just checked the ISW, and that Facebook one actually was me putting that in the wrong place. That was supposed to be in the Zaporizhia tab group. So sorry about that. That's me confusing myself. Easily done. Right, Mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces have transferred additional personnel to Krinky area and that Ukrainian forces intend to cut Russian logistics lines and strike infrastructure connecting the Russian front line to rear areas in occupied Crimea and Kherson Oblast and Zaporizhia Oblast. One Mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces are advancing towards the E58 Oleshki-Kamyanka highway and expressed concern that Ukrainian forces may threaten Russian positions near the E58 and E97 intersection south of Poima, Pishnivka and Pidstepny. Ukrainian military observer Vets reported that Russian forces have committed relatively few units to defend the Oleshka-Novokakovka road and to respond to Ukrainian operations on the East Bank, likely to conserve combat power within the broader Dnipro group of forces. Exactly what I was talking about previously. So let's just talk about that road intersection, which is the E97 coming down here, and then you have the E58 coming up there. So that is the section that the Ukrainians are looking to interdict, but their claims that they've done it up here as well. And the claim from Moshevets is that I think that's him, that the Russians don't have the reserves in place here to defend that road and this line from Novokakovka to Oleshki, really. And we talked about that yesterday because they'd have to draw that from someone else and that leave their weak. So there are other claims that they are going to be bringing troops to bear here. But the question is, will they? And then we hear potential that, going back to what TASS and RAA Novosti was saying, that the Russians are going to regroup in the area and retreat somewhat. So it'll be interesting if that's genuinely on the cards or whether that's a bit of psyops, but it does fit in that idea that they are going to have to regroup and sort themselves out in the area. It does fit in with a load of other information we're hearing from the Dnipro River sector. Right, last thing to say is it's just a video, doesn't mean anything, but Tarantulenko says, is Ukraine now taking advantage of air defense, logistical cutoff of the Kimburn Spit? So let's have a look at this video. This is just a video of people in a boat. The question is, have we seen this video before? And what is it pertaining to? And where are these people going? And the claim here, or at least the implication from Tarantulenko, is these guys are on their way to Kimburn Spit. I don't know. Who knows? I can't talk to that at all. As someone said, let's hope so. Not sure, but there is maritime activity that looks like it's more out in the open sea, which could suggest moving towards Kimburn Spit. If you remember, the Spit here is a national park. It's quite hard to get around this area. The Russians do have artillery there. They have traditionally hammered Ochakiv, which is a kind of marine training area, or was for the Ukrainians, and they've been trying to get counter-battery fire to hammer the Russian artillery here. And indeed, they've taken to successfully controlling the Ukrainians this island, Dnipro-Limansky, Peredny Mayak here, which does have infrastructure on it. But of course, that's then very close to the Russians. It can work both ways. It can mean that they're open to being attacked, or it can mean that they can launch an attack from there. So who knows what is going on, but there could be some activity towards Kimburn Spit or not. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please take care. I really appreciate all your support. It's very kindly accepted. Please like, subscribe and share. It's really important to getting the videos out there that you like them, apparently. So I hear from other YouTubers who say at the end of their videos all the time. Thank you. Toodle pips.